who think that racism is strongest among those lintheads. And as somebody was telling me last night, the people were equating unionism and lynching with two twin evils that came out of this poor white community. Now, where did all that come from? Yeah.
I don't think that it came from. I mean, it was the social. It was the times.
Right.
I mean, it didn't come from union or the workers. I mean, it was the times, and the companies exploited it. Because it was to the company's advantage to exploit that difference between the workers because it could keep them separated, and by keeping them separated, they wouldn't talk about what they was making or what job they was doing or how they was being treated as comparison to each other. It was exploited. But I mean, racism has always been in this country. Let's face it, because of it, and it's always going to be. There's always going to be some form of racism, no matter how well educated or how far along we get. But as far as it coming from union and union lynching and racism, I mean that's the exact opposite of what the word union means. I mean, to be union, you're worker. You're not black worker. You're not white worker. You're worker. Now, the times and people are people, no matter whether they're in the union or not. And you're going to have that with the individual, but not with the organization. And it's just going to happen. But it has nothing to do with the lynching and the word union and racism combined. But the companies love to put out that image, because they could make union an evil thing. They could make the word union evil, and that's what they wanted to do.
Well, now I'll ask each of you: when you were growing up, what did the word union mean to you?
Oh, man. Communist. It was a dirty word.
Start off when I grew up.
When I grew up, once again, you have to understand that I grew up in Kannapolis. Kannapolis is Greek for city of the loon.
They thought they were on the moon. For
city of the loon. Just for someone to mention union, if they were talking about a street, was a negative connotation, period. And I believed all that stuff, and just started unlearning stuff in the last couple of years about the union.
Well, I think that you have had an advantage there, really, though, of course, you're years younger than I am, that I didn't have. Growing up there in Knoxville, I didn't know anything about unions. There was always, or people have told me that there has always been a typographical union there, and that there had always been a carpenters union, and the railroad workers. Mm-hmm. But I knew railroad people, and I knew carpenters and all, but they didn't talk about their union. Right. So I didn't know anything about it. And how we did as well with that Cherokee strike as we did, with none of us knowing anything about unions. Right. And the people around there, of course, and I'm hoping that you don't have the same opposition today that we had. The churches were against us, the law was against us, even our own community neighbors were against us. And we were accused of being communists, and I found out later that those people didn't know the difference between communism and rheumatism. But somebody would start that, that's a communist. I know even after I became an organizer for the AFL, I was down in Georgia working on a little glove factory down there. And there was a man down there who was trying to get his daughter to join the union. And he said, "I think you're one of them Reds." And I said, "Well, exactly what is a Red? I'm not acquainted with that term. What is a Red?" He said, "It's a Russian." And I said, "Well, that couldn't be me because I was born up here in Strawberry Plains, Tennessee. I couldn't possibly be a Red." But he said these unions come in to stir up trouble, and that's just what you are, and you get out of town. Yeah. 3 or 4 other people said the same thing, and I got.
Interestingly enough, during the 1991 Act 2 unionization of Fieldcrest in August, this past August, one of the connotations from that was race. If you vote for the union, if you vote the union in, then you'll have, black people over you. And it was really pitted. It was black against white, kind of,
Right.
during that struggle. And
But the
it was-
company exploited that. They're the ones.
Exactly.
They're the
That's
ones
part
that
of it.
started it and
Exactly.
exploited it because they used it as a tool to divide
Exactly.
as workers. And
Conquer and
that was what
divide.
they wanted to do.
And it worked pretty effectively.
Yeah.
Those marginal voters who wasn't sure one way or the other, it was pretty much like the Helms-Gantt race during the latter stages of that. Just the mere mention of quotas during affirmative
Right.
action turned a lot of people that were marginal that maybe may vote for Gantt instead of Helms, but throwing the race in really changed that. People who were like on the border, not knowing which way they wanted to vote. So for the people that were on the border and voting for the union or for the company, that institution of race certainly pushed them more toward the company because the company really exploited, just like you said, and worked that issue.
Well, isn't that based on the same principle of divide and conquer?
Exactly.
They divide you so that you figure that instead of working together, that you're competing with each other. That then they can beat the union and knock it down. Of course, see, I was more fortunate than most of you people. I was brought up in a union family. And my father was a member of the Meat Cutters Union. Had been for a long time, so I got my trade unionism from that. But in those days, which was before the Bolshevik Revolution, they didn't call us communists because the communists hadn't appeared on the scene at that time. They didn't come along until in the 17s and 18s and so on. But we were different because what we were trying to do, we were trying to upset whatever was going on. And in those days, why, unions were a very small minority of the population too. And I remember that the meat cutters that my father belonged to would have an occasional strike, and that would be in the markets in Birmingham. And they didn't have a hall to meet. They used to meet in each other's houses, and there'd be somebody outside watching to see. And in those days, why, when there was picketing, everybody picketed. There was no strike relief. There was no relief of any kind.
Right.
And that's been changed, and that's part of what the difference is now. And then I remember when I grew up in Alabama that all the mills were white. The only place that you saw any blacks at all was either in the receiving or the shipping department, and they had the sweeping jobs, and that was it, period. And they were the lowest paid. And always there would be one man who would be black who took care of the bosses in the office there. And he was we used to call him the Uncle Tom, because he was the one that we would never talk in front of, because if you did, they knew it in the office there. It wasn't until we got into World War II, if you want to really look at history, what changed the textile industry. And with the advent of the rayon mills and the nylon mills that we no longer would call cotton mill workers, it was textile with the union. It was textile because of the different fabrics and the blends that were coming along. And because of the shortage of men, women were being hired in jobs that men occupied in the mill. Just like you had your difference between the races, you had your difference between the sexes. Men had, you didn't see a woman in the weave room. You didn't see a woman on looms. You didn't see a woman fixer.
No, you didn't.
All men, all men. And those were the high-paying jobs. If you said you were a loom fixer, you were up there. If you said you were a comber or a spinner or worked in the winding room, you didn't amount to anything. Even among us in the cotton mills, that's when also the blacks began to come into the mill because they were short-handed. And they began to move them in and move them in. And then when the war was over, a lot of women got fired. I remember at the Sales Biltmore Bleacheries up in Asheville, North Carolina. We had an arbitration case there with where the union handled it for our people, where the company was firing, I think it was some 30-odd women who had worked all through the war, had worked before that time in the mill, had moved up on jobs that the men had left, and when they came back, they were entitled to their jobs, and the company was letting them go purely on the basis that they were women. I have to tell you a little story about that. The arbitrator was an old man that I knew, and he loved his grandchildren. And we had several of our people who were members who had grandchildren. And I said, if you have an opportunity, bring the pictures of your grandchildren, and if you got a chance, pull them out. And I want you to know that I think we put this lady on. I asked her how long she'd worked there, and she said, I think it was 20-some years. He said, you don't look like you're old enough to work 20-some years. She says, I don't. She pulled out, she said, look at my grandchildren. From then on, we won our case. We won it. But that's how women came into it. That's how blacks came into things. We
Did
had
you,
a problem.
did you tell the story about wanting to be a loom fixer?
Who, me?
Yeah.
No, it was a winding machine
Yeah.
operator. I was a winding machine operator there at the Cherokee Spinning Company. Those little winding machines were called universal winders. We wound thread from a cone onto a spool.
Right.
And that was what we did. We stood in front of that little machine and worked it all day. Well, our fixer there my machine would break down. And sometimes it'd be a long time before the fixer could get around to me. Well, that was money to me because I was on piecework. So I learned to fix my machine myself. I watched him, and I finally took a screwdriver and a pair of pliers to work with me. And when my machine would break down, I could fix it. I had watched him long enough. So I asked the straw boss one day, I said, I'm going to talk to the superintendent over here about me getting a job as a fixer. Because as a winding machine operator, I was making $8.40 a week, and a fixer was making $14. So I wanted to be a fixer. And when I mentioned it to him, he said, are you crazy or something? Woman can't be a fixer. And I tried to argue with him, and he looked at me like, you know, we better watch her. She's kind of crazy talking about a woman being a fixer.
Tom?
I'd like to comment on what she's talking about. When I've been in the mill since I was 16, 18 years, and it's amazing how much it's changed. When I went to work at Eagle and Fence, we had one black loom fixer. And now, the mill I work at now, there's a total of 9 loom fixers, and 5 of them are black. And as a matter of fact, we're going into a weekend shift, and I'm training a woman to fix looms right now.
Oh, that's great. That is great.
Well, now, why do you think this change has happened, Tom?
I think a lot of it is with just the times, and the blacks are getting more educated, you know, and women are finally, you know, women are tired of not getting the money for, you know, it's not so much heavy lifting on the technical jobs no more. It's a lot up here now, you know, we're used to.
I don't think you agreed with what he said. What did
No,
you?
I do not.
I like that reaction. I didn't like it. About the education.
Well, I went to work in the mill when I was 16 years old. Didn't finish school or nothing. You didn't have the opportunities like you do
But
now.
the education was not the point. The first mill I worked at was West Point Pepperell. I started filling batteries. I've always been heavy. I like myself. You know, I feel I can do anything you can do. Just show me what you're doing. When like I said, I started filling batteries. I asked the supervisor, well, teach me to weave. We can't teach you to weave, you're left-handed. Then that was actually the case. They would not, there was no left-handed weavers. You know, that there were women, there were men weavers, but they were all right-handed. That, of course, is to me discrimination.
Yeah.
I said, you show me, you stand in front of me and show me what you're doing, and leave it to me to take responsibility for what I'm doing. So they taught me, you know, they gave me a chance. They said, we're going to give you 8 hours. If you cannot learn to tie a weave knot, you know, from the instructor in this 8 hours, then you must go back to filling the batteries. And so we sat down in what they had the training room at West Point Pepperell, and she was going to sit beside me. I said, no, you sit in front of me. You know, I can accomplish more if you sit in front of me. You know, it makes me nervous. Anyway, she sat in front of me and showed me how to tie a weave knot. By the time the 8 hours was over, I had not only learned to tie it, I had maxed the speed that they wanted me to max before they put me on the floor doing it. When you said that about the education, it's not so much the fact that the people were unable to do it. It was the fact that the people in the company were unwilling for them
Unwilling
to
to
do
let
it.
you do it.
Didn't give you the opportunity.
That's right.
Well, they wanted to maintain the status quo.
Right. When
You know,
also,
status.
at West Point Pepperell, being me, after I learned to weave, and I had been weaving for a year or so, I want to fix. my motives for wanting to fix were a lot different from perhaps, your motives for doing it. At the time I was weaving, I could make more money than a fixer weaving on my job.
Mhm.
What I wanted to learn to weave for, or to fix for, was the fact that if I can do the job, I don't need you. Therefore I can get it done. That's my money. Like you said, that's my money
And
standing.
fix your loom and
That's
keep
right.
going.
That's what I wanted to do.
So when they couldn't deny me because it was time for ERA and all this, they'd come in. So, but they could make it very difficult, which they did. There was no test for us to take. There was at West Point, at Fieldcrest, and I failed it, they said. But at West Point Prep Rail, they put me in the training room for the fixers. The instructor helped me tear the machine down, the section that he wanted me to work on. There were a couple of male trainees also, so he went over there. Now he helped those two men put that machine back together.
Didn't help
I
me.
was told to get it running. End of subject. When I said, wait a minute, give me a book. If you give me a book, I can do anything you want me to do. I was told to do it from memory. Now, I can't even cook the same dish twice from memory.
But how about making it hard on you? I
Yeah,
remember we were talking last night about in Cushman Mill in Williamson, South Carolina. There's a story that is still going around, but like in around 1980, there were 16 shift supervisors, and one was a woman, and one was a person of color at the time. But with the women, what they would do, you had of course go through all the different types of training, including loom fixing. And when they put her through that training, I remember there's like a huge nut and bolt directly at the bottom of the loom. And the proper way to get it is, they have a big T-wrench. It may be 3 or 4 feet high, and it's got the handles, and you have some leverage so you can get to it. Well, when they were training her, they told her that she had to loosen that nut, and they gave her a wrench about that big. I just thought it was the funniest thing, She ended up loosening it with that, which kind of checked out.
One of the things that happened when I made the comment that Fieldcrest had a test that you had to take to become a fixer. I feel like I have as much common sense as the next person. As far as going through any sort of mechanical training, I haven't. Like in school where they identify all these silly little parts or the tools that you use. I feel like I could get the job done. And the person that was giving the test asked me, well, what are you going to do, being a woman, if you have to pick up this big part? That, the machine needs a big part. Well, I said, I'm going to do like all these other men. I'm going to get something to carry it, and I'm going to get some help. Of course, that's not what they wanted to hear. I would have to have done it myself.
Right. The way they did that test, though, that you're talking about, was you never received your test
No,
scores at
I
all.
never saw it.
Blacks took the test, women took the test, white men took the test. 9 out of 10 white men passed the test. Maybe 1 out of 10 black men passed the test, and no women ever passed the test.
No women
One
ever
person
passed
has passed the test.
Well,
at Fieldcrest Mill, that's a woman.
that's because the difference is that when you have a union in the plant, you've got a machinery that you can go through, that you can grieve and do something about it. And if you follow through like you're supposed to, you can do it. You were talking about spinning. We had a rayon mill up in Asheville where the whole thing in the spinning room was men. And there was one of the women who had been working in one of the other departments, and she bid when the job was posted under the union contract on the job in the spinning room. And they turned it down and said that women couldn't do it. And they used as the excuse that the machines were so tall this women were smaller, so they couldn't reach up and grab the end when it broke so they could tie it in. And she said, I can do it. And she had been watching them. And so she filed a grievance. We had to go to arbitration with it. And that was the reason that the company used in the arbitration. So I said, well, let's us give her a chance. Let's see whether she can do it. The company said, that's the only reason. The arbitrator said, let's go over there and let her try it. We went over there and she tried it. She did all right. All the company says she can do it once or twice or 3 times, when it's time to take the spools off and tie them back in. She said she could do the whole job. We said, okay, leave her on for a full shift. We left her on for a full shift. She did it. She was able to do it. She was a strong woman. She was not particularly big in terms of height or weight, either one. but she could get around just as well as any of the men did, and she broke the barrier in the spinning room. We've got more women in there now, I think, than we probably got men.
Well, it's significant to me that you had the civil rights movement. I don't think that the blacks in the mills now are in there just because of World War II. You had a lot of political pressure through the civil rights movement.
Civil rights.
And you've had a lot of pressure from the women's movement and the women voting.
And from unions too.
And yet the unions have been constantly defeated in the South, in the textiles. Does that mean that because they didn't win elections, that the unions didn't have any power? It seems to me that studying history, we've seen that the unions were responsible for a lot of the things that have improved work here, even though they didn't have a contract. Could you talk about that? You particularly, because you might identify yourself and so forth.
Yeah, I'm Charles Taylor from Greenville, South Carolina, and after my experience was totally different. I was like on the flip side, because I began, looking back, I was part of that new trend of getting, green people out of college, young people out of college and making them supervisors, instead of people working their way up through the ranks. So I went to work, for Milliken as a supervisor and management training and a shift supervisor. And so I had the complete opposite experience. Like when I went to cash a check, they saw Milliken on there. It was like gold. I could just put down my Milliken ID and just boom, service. Whereas now I would have to have 9 credit cards. And, after working there several years, this whole double standard of living, just totally separate between the way supervisors lived and people who work on the shift lived. And so I left just kind of out of protest and defected to a group that was called the Workers' Rights Project, which had been going. And that kind of came out of a failed union organizing drive. The J.P. Stevens campaign, in the late 70s. And that was successful in a lot of places. But in Greenville, we had 18 Stevens plants just in Greenville County. And none of those even got to election, much less won one. So when they had the national settlement, when was that, 79, 80? That was it. Kind of everything folded up and Greenville moved on. And so during that time, a lot of people have been contacting the organizers for help, but who were not involved in the Stevens campaign or did not have access to a union. And so for the last 10 years, that's basically what, first it was called the Workers' Rights Project, now it's called the Carolina Alliance for Fair Employment. And that's what we've been trying to do since then, is try to figure out, in the short term, in the absence of unions, how people can try to protect themselves and hopefully work toward that end.
Well, now,
Let me just add something there. In Knoxville, we had the Standard Knitting Mills. They went out of business about 2 years ago. And we had tried since 1934. In 1934, we tried to organize the Standard. We were doing fairly well in the other mills around there, but we get nowhere with the Standard. Every time we put on an organizing drive, Standard would increase the benefits somehow for the people. They were the first mill in Knoxville to have air conditioning. They put in a cafeteria for the people. And years later, in fact, it was just a few years ago, a woman who worked in the office there told me that the workers in there would say all the time, "I wish they'd start another organizing drive." And of course, back in, they'd talk about, well, we're getting better conditions than you are, and we're not paying dues. Well, of course, that endeared them to us very, very much, But William Green was president of the AFL at that time, and I told him about the story of how we tried to organize them and how we were getting better working conditions all around for them. And he said, well, after all, you're doing some good, and that's what the labor movement is supposed to be doing. And let me just add here, too, you mentioned it, I think at the beginning of this meeting, about there being racism among the workers themselves. I saw a very good example of that at the Standard Mill about 3 or 4 years ago before they moved out there. They also gave their employees uniforms. Every employee had a green and white uniform. We didn't want uniforms at Cherokee. We didn't want anybody to know we worked there, in those very early days. But these people had those green and white uniforms, therefore you could identify them anywhere in town. And when I saw about 100 of those people in a white restaurant with their black and white employees there all together. I said, well, we've come a long ways. And I don't think there is racism among the workers at all. They were just all laughing and talking together, and as I saw them leave, they were all mixed as they were getting into the cars, you know. And but I found out later that they were all good friends in there.
Well, the thing
So
that
it's not with the
surprised me
workers.
as a Southerner, growing up here now, living a long time away and then coming back, is that we can be comfortable here in
Mhm.
this community with blacks and whites, and we can go to restaurants and all this kind of thing together. But as soon as you introduce a possibility of union, I can just feel things tightening up. I saw it in Kannapolis, and I talked to people who are born and raised union people in other jobs. Fella said, don't bring the union here because it's going to split this community apart. Why? Why does union still split things when even race doesn't split it quite that much?
Tradition. Tradition.
Tradition is right.
You know, that's what,
I don't think it's the union, I think it's the company. Because when the union comes in, the company is the one that opens up and says, the blacks are gonna be against the whites are gonna be against the blacks. And if they've got a rift between the two races, if the whites find out the blacks are gonna vote for the union, they're not gonna vote for the union. In the same way with the blacks.
That's very true. We've had a couple of organizing drive here, one at the Columbus Carpet Plant, and there are family members there that I know personally. Just a little short story. I read an article from a union buster who had spent 20 years in business, and he basically laid out how they, as company consultants, go about, separating and antagonizing the races. And no true example could have existed, other than Columbus Carpet. There are family members right now to this day that don't speak to one another or have difficulty in their relationship because one decided to stay with the company and the other decided to vote union. And I see it all around. I work at the Eagle plant, even though the company tried to get away from that image, but it's still practiced. Every time that we try to achieve something, the issue of race always surfaces. And one day in the canteen, two of the white fixers said they wished that the condition was the way it were when Eagle and Phoenix were owned by Reed Brothers. And just before before the union came in down there, you still had the sign that said the white water fountain and the black water fountains. And I have an aunt, she's a sweeper, now in spinning. She even, told me the story of when she first got hired, and she had learned how to do spinning just by watching, the white operators. And when she tried to learn how to do it, she said they confronted her. This is a white person's job. Colored people don't do this. That's the term they use. Colored people don't spin. And she said, well, why? She said, I can do just as good a job. Well, that's the way it is. You don't do this.
Well, one of the things I'm curious about, all of you